The title of the session is Stewardship and Engagement, Navigating Disruptive Technology. And let me start by saying welcome everyone in the room, but also welcome everyone on Zoom. Technology is a wonderful thing. It has made our life during the pandemic a lot easier. We were able to socialize. We were in fact not socially distanced. We were rather physically distanced, and social life kept going with the help of technology. So we are going to today look at, in this session, we're going to look at how technology affects stewardship. And we had a pre-meeting, and I'm going to start by pulling out two themes from that pre-meeting to prep you a little bit about what to expect. So there are two themes that come out. One is technology can be used and is being used, as we will see, to identify investments, to work out where funds are invested. It also is important to know if you're invested in technology, is that ethical technology? So in relation to the investments that you hold. And then also technology comes in, and that's very close to the mechanics of stewardship, as a helper to help investors exercise rights. And we will discuss both aspects on this panel. Let me then quickly introduce the panel in alphabetical order. There is, hang on, I got this right. Well, there's Will Goodwin, who is here from Tumelo, and he's a co-founder and head of product. And Tumelo is a fintech focused on giving investors access to their shareholder rights. We have Michael Kind, he's from Share Action, and he's a senior campaigns manager, and he's responsible at responsible investment charity Share Action, and he leads to educate and mobilize individual citizens in pursuit of raising standards of investment. And then we've got Anna McDonald. She works for the Church of England. She is the secretary of the Church of England's Ethical Investment Advisory Group, and they provide ethical investment advice to the Church of England. And then last but not least, we've got Jacob Thome, and he's an expert in sustainable finance and long-term risk, and he co-founded Second Investment Initiative Network, and he serves, which operates in Berlin and New York, and he serves as an executive director in the German branch of that business. So I'm going to pass on to Anna for her remarks.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. So this afternoon we're looking at kind of investing in disruptive technologies, and I think all investors, whether we're retail or institutional, are probably invested in disruptive technologies, whether we intentionally choose to be so or not. So in addition to the Alphabets and the Metas or the Baidus and the Tencents of this world, you can see that computational tech, algorithmic algorithms, machine learning techniques, artificial intelligence are increasingly being embraced and deployed in companies all around the world, and they have an enormous power to transform industries throughout the world. And so we've seen in healthcare, for example, AI technologies being used to detect and diagnose serious health conditions. In agriculture, technologies being used to decide the optimal time and place to plant crops. In transportation, Uber can work out the quickest place to get to for the least amount of carbon emissions, and obviously lots of carbon tech innovations. But at the same time that we've seen these amazing technological innovations, we're also increasingly aware that disruptive technologies and automated systems, particularly those that are deployed in industries that directly impact how people live their lives, can bring and have brought significant harm to people and communities. And so, for example, AI technologies deployed in welfare systems. Virginia Eubanks has written quite extensively in a book called Automating Inequality. There's lots of examples that Cathy O'Neill has given, but perhaps the most recent scandal that's kind of hit headlines recently has been the algorithms that were used in the Dutch Child Benefits Office. These are really quite horrifying stories that have been revealed. Thousands of lives ruined by an algorithm that was intended to spot benefit fraud, but doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is classify people into certain categories and then make decisions about them. But what it ended up doing was reinforcing historic biases about categories of people that are of low income or from families with dual nationalities. And the outcome of this automated system was just to perpetuate those historic biases. And we've seen algorithms used in social media, algorithms to curate content or to recommend content or recommend products. And these algorithms have spread misinformation or conspiracy theory, have also been associated with inciting violence, particularly that directed towards the Rohingya minorities in Myanmar, or those living in northern Tigray in Ethiopia most recently. So AI, disruptive technologies, they can be used in welfare, policing decisions, are also used in employment. And some of you may know Christine Chow at HSBC has written a recent white paper on the use of automated systems in HR and employment law. The key thing really to remember is that when we reduce human beings and the complexity, all of the complexity of human beings and our uniqueness into a kind of set of numbers or a categorization or statistics, that needs to be done with extreme sensitivity and extreme caution. And so we have this kind of great kind of dilemma. We've got the great hope of the transformative power of tech, but also this real need and concern to ensure that we understand the systemic risks associated with deploying kind of disruptive technologies. Now, obviously, for us as investors, this is important. For us at the Church of England, it's extremely important. We at the Church of England, our investing bodies, deliberately invest in line with Christian theology, and specifically in line with our Anglican beliefs and values. And we've got a long tradition of investing for the long-term good, of considering environmental and social and governance factors. But alongside the stewardship considerations and the stewardship codes and the regulatory regimes that we operate in, we look to scripture, we look to Christian tradition and reason to help guide our investment decisions. Now, historically, rather than kind of cherry picking an individual biblical verse, thou shalt not steal or love thy neighbor, we have a bigger picture approach to Christian theology. And to be extremely reductionist, and I'm getting a bit nervous if there are any theologians in the room because they will accuse me of being extremely reductionist, but I can give you 4 theological principles and make sure that I'm not, the theologians don't get too cross. But there are 4 basic Christian theological principles that guide all of our words and actions in the church, and therefore also all the words and actions of the church's investments. And these are, number 1 is human flourishing. And that's that we believe all humans should flourish. And that means individually, humans have a irremovable dignity that must be protected and respected. But it also means flourishing in relationship. We are, as humans, we form relationships with each other. And whatever serves those relationships helps us to flourish. So that's 1, human flourishing. Number 2 is standing with the vulnerable. And the Bible consistently teaches that God is concerned for those who are hurting, for those on the fringes of society, those who are marginalized, those who are excluded from power. Number 3 is we feel we are called to care for creation. We want to safeguard the beauty and creativity of the planet that we live in. And our final one is serve the common good. We live in communities and our lives are structured by those organizations and institutions that constitute those communities, and it's those communities that's the common good. And we want to see businesses exist that serve that common good. So over the past few years, we have done a lot of thinking about how we can steward our investments in disruptive technologies in line with these theological principles of human flourishing and standing with the marginalized and caring for creation and serving the common good. So, for example, what does it look like for humans to flourish in a tech-enabled world? Do humans have the freedom to flourish? Do they have the freedom to search for truth? Do they have the freedom to make decisions rather than be nudged into potentially addictive behaviors or be classified into certain categories that might be generic but not completely accurate? The mass collection, analysis, and use of data about people, whether that's where they work, where they studied, what they like to do, who they like to socialize with, what they think, what they look like. All of this has a transformatory power, but it also, as we spoke of earlier, if you're basing decisions on those sorts of categories, it needs to be done with extreme sensitivity. And so any industry that is using data, collecting data, analyzing it, using it, deploying automated systems needs to do so in a way where it is responsible and it understands the impacts that it may have. Now, disruptive technology is obviously by definition disruptive, and regulation around the world is massively catching up, and we've seen lots of regulation in the EU, in the DMA, in the DSA, AI Act in the EU. We're seeing the online safety bill come in the UK. I'll speed up massively just to say that given the fragmented nature of all of this regulation around the world, it's really important that it's imperative that companies and investors do not hew close to the rules. It's really important that all stakeholders, companies and investors together take responsibility for the outcomes and impacts that these automated systems can have upon society. I shall stop there. That's to you, Jacob.
And now I feel like I have two microphones. Okay. God forbid. Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Thome. I'm the Executive Director at the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. It's really nice to be here today. And I already remarked over lunch that the previous panel was probably the best one I've been in a long time. And so I hope we can live up to that level. I want to pick up on what Anna said about the idea that... That might be my phone, sorry. I want to pick up on what Anna said about the kind of duality of technology and basically cover 4 points, right? So from an investment and stewardship perspective, technology does 4 things. One, it destroys value, right? So that's one issue. The second, it transforms value. That's the second issue. The third is that it helps us inform. It informs the investors about the world that we're investing in, and it can help empower. And I'm going to try and briefly tell that journey across those 4 points. And when we get to empower, then I'll pass over to Mello to talk a little bit about how they see that angle. So how does it destroy value? We've already seen some of the social value, but obviously I work a lot on climate change, and that's where it becomes very apparent, because at the end of the day, climate change is a technology problem. The reason we're able to create global warming is because we have the technological means to exploit the planet's resources the way we do. And that creates incredible uncertainty because the nature of that destruction is unprecedented. And so we don't know as investors, or investors don't know how to approach that uncertainty. Just to give you one example. So often when we think, one of the issues in climate change are so-called tipping points, right? So we have the reversal of the Gulf Stream, or the melting of the Antarctic, or methane in Siberia, or the Amazon rainforest. So the 2% kind of extreme percentile of tipping points basically means that the social cost of carbon is 350% higher than it is under a base case. That's a dramatic difference, right? Now, 2% doesn't sound like a lot per se. That means when you run your life 50 times, one of those 50 times is going to be basically borderline uninhabitable, if not uninhabitable future, right? And that's the current, it's not if we're talking here about This is just one of the probabilities based on a base case warming scenario of around 3 degrees at the moment, right? These aren't kind of extreme events necessarily. So it's one way that we talk about technology destroying value and how it can affect investment. So the second thing is obviously transforms value, and often we think here about renewables, but just to give you again one other anecdote in the world from climate change. So if you take, there's a set of technologies that we don't think about in the low carbon transition typically. Artificial intelligence has been mentioned, shared economy. There are things related to nanotechnology, quantum computing. You just take all these things together and look at all the different studies about the climate impact of those non-climate technologies. That's the equivalent in terms of destroying oil demand as all the climate technologies. So all the non-climate breakthrough technologies can have the same effect as what the International Energy Agency says the climate technologies will have over the next 20, 25 years. So again, now we're dealing really with dramatic uncertainty because investors are already struggling to wrap their head around renewables and what's happening in the oil markets and all these things we don't often think about. They can have the equivalent effect. Now, of course, those are very rebound effects and so on. But again, this is where technology transforms. This is where uncertainty comes into play. But this session today isn't just about investing generally. We're interested in stewardship and engagement. And this is where two areas of technology are really interesting in how they inform investment decisions. And the first one, as I said, is informing, and the other one is empowering. So if it just comes to questions of informing, again, two very brief examples. So one of the areas of informing is obviously the transformation of risk models that we're seeing at the moment and how they move away from these binary stress tests to one of the projects we're doing now with the supervisor, who's really running several hundreds of thousands of climate simulations as part of a financial analysis. So obviously these kind of Monte Carlo simulations are not that new, but the computing power and the modeling power we have right now really allows us to deal with uncertainty in a dramatically different way. The traditional question of a stress test is, are you going to be solvent under this future? Are you going to be able to survive this financial shock, right? The new types of questions in this uncertain world is under how many futures do you survive, right? And that's because of the ability, that's one, the technology brings that uncertainty into the analysis, but the other piece is that models allow us to be more intelligent about how we engage with that. And the other piece around informing is informing people about what is actually going on, being more granular about what their investments look like. So last year we launched this platform called My Fair Money, and it's live now in the UK, in France, and in Germany. Obviously in France it's called the My Fair Money. That's a bad joke. And we have different names. Anyway, in the UK it's called My Fair Money, myfairmoney.com. And this is really designed to help retail investors understand what's in their funds and how they can translate their sustainability objectives into investment decisions, right? And what's really interesting about this process is that it really obviously informs retail investors in a really interesting way. And there are certain, I mean, this isn't rocket science what we're doing, but I don't think a platform like that would have necessarily been possible 5, 6, 7 years ago. But the other thing is it's also just this ability to talk to each other. So one of the examples that we find really often on this platform is that investors who also go on this platform complain, it says your My Fund has animal testing, and that's not true, right? And then we look into the fund and we go, well, you have medical animal testing in the fund, and I think that still qualifies animal testing. Then the investor goes, look, I'm a SRI investor. Medical animal testing is a good thing because we're helping develop medication, and that's great. That's good for humanity. So this is a good ethical thing to do. But obviously the problem is the typical retail investor who cares about animal testing is probably, to not be too stereotypical, a vegan investor, and they don't care. They don't care about the medical, the nuance, the ESG justification. They don't want to invest in animal testing. And whether you think they're right or wrong, that's their investment objective. And so the suitability of the fund is not given when you invest in medical animal testing. And I think that kind of granularity is really starting to transform the debate from, oh, you're a retail investor who wants to do sustainability. Here's an ESG fund, or here's an ex-fossil fuel fund, to something that really brings the granularity of their objectives to the fore. And that comes in a lot of different areas. That comes in the area of animal testing. It comes in the area of ex-fossil free. Does a 10% threshold where a company with less than 10% coal qualify as not having fossil fuels, which is a threshold in many funds? Does a retail investor accept that threshold? Or do they say, when it says ex-fossil free on the tin, when it says I don't drink alcohol, it doesn't mean Sundays I get an off day, right? It means I don't invest in fossil fuels and I never drink alcohol. So that's really important. And maybe just one final note, and then I'll leave you to talk about how technology can empower retail investors, is related to now I lost my train of thought as I was transitioning. I was so happy about my transition, and that's probably a sign that I should stop talking and transition to you. It was a good transition at the expense of my last thought. But anyway, that's my input for now.
Thanks. Does that work? Maybe. Great. Fantastic. Hi. Yeah, I'm Will. I head up products at Tumelo, and I think I'll start actually with the original experience of turning up to an AGM. So this is actually how Tumelo started in quite a lot of ways. We started by actually turning up to some AGMs at public companies in the UK. So we got one of them was Rolls-Royce, for instance. We got our invite. We went along to the meeting. This one was great. This one was actually great. We got a glass of champagne when we entered. We felt very special. And then they actually brought up topics. They gave a summary of how the business was doing, the strategic objectives. They let us vote on key issues. And then we left. And the overall experience was you actually left feeling like an owner of this company. That's actually what you were by investing in these shares. And then we had a similar one at Next. And actually, when we left here, they gave us discount cards for their shops, which was great. We owned a piece of the company. They valued us. They actually let us go shopping, and we got a 30% discount when we went Next left. And in a lot of ways, it's this feeling of ownership that we're trying to create at Tumelo. So on the one hand, companies really, who do they serve? They serve their shareholders. They should be held accountable by their shareholders. But the problem is no one really knows who the shareholders are anymore. The industry, as it has developed, has divided itself up into lots of different pieces. If you want to invest as a retail investor now, or as a pension member, actually, you first start by downloading an investment app, a broker dealer in the sort of industry term, and they just handle the front end. They don't handle any of the back office stuff. It turns out they've outsourced it to a custodian. They've outsourced the trading to maybe Seckle or Alpaca, another third party supplier. And maybe you've actually invested in a fund. So you're not actually the owner of the shares in the fund. The fund manager is. And so you have this hugely disintermediated chain where it's actually incredibly hard to figure out what people own. And that's kind of where technology comes in, and that's where Tumelo comes in. We figure out that initial piece of ownership. So if you are a pension fund investor and you're invested in a model portfolio, which in turn is invested in a fund of funds, which is in turn invested in 3 funds, which is in turn invested in companies, we pick apart this full chain. So at any point in the chain, you can figure out what you actually own, your aggregated ownership. And we do this if you're a direct shareholder or through funds. And what this unlocks really, and what technology really unlocks, is now the ability to exercise those rights. So and this is where it really comes in. Typically, technology really is about mapping together this data in the back end, doing a hugely complex task, and then in the front end, bringing it together into a really great user experience that people actually want to use. So you might have seen the cushion ads on the tube on your way here, but we offer this solution to retail investors where within their investment app, they can actually exercise their voting rights because we have figured out this full voting chain. And it starts with expression of wish, where it might be a fund manager doesn't want to split, wants to maintain control over their voting rights and doesn't want to split it, and it's just customer feedback. It can be split voting, where they actually carve out the AUM of the investors in their fund. If it's a direct holding, we pass that all the way back. And we're about to launch the discounts, so owning parts of these companies. So ultimately, the real focus for us from a technology perspective is how, and bring it back to that initial shareholder meeting where we turned up, they gave us a glass of champagne and we felt like an owner, is how can we bring that experience back, but in the modern age where all of your investments are on your mobile phone? How can you be made to feel like an owner?
Hopefully this will work. Cool. So I'm Michael and I'm from Share Action. For those of you who don't know, Share Action are a campaigning charity whose vision is for a world that, for a financial system that works for people and planet. And our theory of change largely relies upon mobilising the power of the investment community to achieve those ends. So we work in partnership with investors, whether they be asset managers, asset owners, charitable investors, etc., to build coalitions of investors that look to drive change within investee companies on specific ESG topics. And I'm going to speak a little bit today about, it's a bit weird this mic, isn't it? Is it right for everyone? It's cutting out. Yeah, I'll use that one. Cool. How's that? That's a little bit less stressful, isn't it? Cool. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the role of the annual general meeting, sort of building on what Will's spoken about, and how developments in tech, sort of post-COVID, have really enabled investors to do a lot more around the annual general meeting. And I think it's worth saying to start with that as an organisation, we've always been a real advocate for the role of the annual general meeting within stewardship. We like to think of it as the stage, I guess, on which a lot of the kind of key stewardship moments happen. And I guess just to kind of zoom out and then think about kind of the stewardship opportunities in AGM, as an investor, as a shareholder, you have the right to turn up and ask a question or make a statement to the board. You have the opportunity to file shareholder resolutions in advance of the AGM that get voted on, and you can vote on sort of standing resolutions and other kind of resolutions that have been filed by other shareholders. And I'm going to focus on the kind of first two there and how tech's enabled investors to do more kind of on the kind of asking questions point, but on the filing resolutions point. And I want to kind of begin that by painting a picture of what AGMs were like before COVID, because it's not a nice picture. It's quite a pathetic picture in some ways, and it's good to start there to kind of understand kind of the impact that tech can have here. So if you went to a corporate AGM before COVID, like if you went to like a big hitter like Barclays or HSBC, you're guaranteed it's a slightly different experience. But for most FTSE 100 AGMs, there is like literally no one there apart from the board and maybe a couple of like retail shareholders who are like, we joke that they're there for the free lunch, and often they are. And they're really short. There's very few institutional investors, if any, present. And there's very rarely, across the board in the UK at least, any shareholder resolutions that have been put to the board on ESG issues. And that's a big shame because the AGM is a massive opportunity in lots of ways. Like if you're an investor turning up trying to engage with a company, it's probably the one chance you have in the year to engage with the entire company of a board. If you have an engagement meeting, it's likely to be maybe, I don't know, like someone from the board and then operational staff. You're kind of able to interact with and listen to other shareholders and other stakeholders who might have gained access to the AGM to kind of understand their take on the kind of salient ESG issues. And ultimately, within the kind of entire engagement and stewardship process, the AGM through voting is where like legally binding decisions are made that actually really impact what happens in a company in the future. So it's a shame that kind of investors weren't taking up that opportunity. And kind of as an organization, we've always really believed in the power of AGMs, like I've said, and I think we've evidenced how you can use AGMs to affect change and drive change in investee companies. So as I said, we build these coalitions of investors, and there's an example, which is our Good Work Coalition, which brings together 40 institutional investors, asset owners, asset managers who really care about work and understand that, say, paying a living wage to your staff is going to be good for the company in the long run. When we started going to AGMs to ask questions and make statements in 2011, only 3 of the FTSE 100 were paying the real living wage to their staff. That's now up to 50. We can't claim all of that because there's a whole range of civil society organisations working on that issue. But we have been told again and again that our presence at AGMs has really put it on the agenda, kept it on the agenda, and sort of helped build momentum. So we were really excited over the course of the pandemic to see AGMs begin to move online and see companies beginning to experiment with these types of technologies, because in the past, like, you had to go to London, you had to be there on a Tuesday at like 2 p.m. for 2 hours. Like, there's a reason there were very few people there. And actually, it's really kind of quite interesting to see them move to kind of either virtual meetings or hybrid meetings that combine both an in-person and virtual element, because it really broadens the opportunity for access. Like, if you're an investor and you're based in a completely different part of the world, you can suddenly turn up. So that's a really exciting development. We're kind of yet to see lots of investors taking up that opportunity. So keen to kind of keep an eye on whether that happens. But it's a really interesting development in this space that we should be really aware of. I think there's still some questions around the kind of quality of engagement you can have kind of through attending virtually. Like, from my experience, that if you're in the room with someone, you're often much able to have a better conversation with them. You can follow up, you can dig deep into the detail. So there's some work to be done there, but it's a really interesting development sort of over the last couple of years that could really lead to kind of better engagement practices. And then the second thing I wanted to just talk about quickly was about filing shareholder resolutions and the kind of role this can play for investors as part of their engagement strategy. So I think right at the beginning of today, I think it was Jennifer, but I might be misquoting and I might have misremembered the name, so apologies. But I think we spoke about sort of types of engagement and like the sort of the groups that lead, the sort of groups of people that lead to engagement programs happening. So we spoke about kind of trade bodies leading engagement programs. We talked about sort of cross-transnational sort of engagement-led programs. I think what was, I think if you look at the UK context, what often happens is you have civil society-led engagement programs that happen, and especially when it comes to the filing of shareholder resolutions on ESG issues, that only happens in the UK when a civil society organisation like ShareAction like leads that. And again, the kind of process of filing a shareholder resolution is one that, like, pre-COVID and still now in many ways is like incredibly not ready, has not been adapted for like technology whatsoever. And that's partly because to file a shareholder resolution in the UK, you either need 5% of the share capital of a company, good luck, or you can like get together 100 people, whether they're institutional investors or retail investors, bring them together and file a resolution. That is incredibly hard to do. When we file resolutions at ShareAction, we get maybe like 10 to 15 institutional investors to file, and then have to find 80 to 85 retail investors who are willing to do that. You have to explain to them what a shareholder resolution is. You have to take them through the process of getting hold of a share. They have to fill out a whole range of complicated paperwork. It's like a 3-month-long intense campaign you have to run. It's very difficult. And when the majority of shareholder resolutions that are filed are being done through this process, then there's a natural kind of shrinking on the amount of that type of engagement that can happen. So a really interesting tech development that's happened there is that we kind of recognized that as an organization, figured out that our like limit was to file 1 shareholder resolution a year, and invested in technology to understand how we could kind of smooth that process out and make it way easier. So we built like an automated web platform basically that handles a load of that communication, takes people through that process to make it very, very simple for them to file these shareholder resolutions. And as a consequence of doing that, we're now in a place as an organization where our capacity to file resolutions is probably about 5 a year. We filed 3 this year at Sainsbury's, HSBC and Unilever. So it's a really interesting development in that way, in tech enabling kind of organizations that are leading shareholder engagement to do more. And I think that will continue to grow both in the UK, but also in other countries. There's a new startup in the US called TulipShare, who you might have heard of, who are doing sort of similar work in the US context. So yeah, another recent shift, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you, wonderful. So let me sort of continue this by pulling this together a little bit. So what we're seeing is this conference started with the observation that there's complexity and stewardship isn't simple. And I think we've seen this in this panel, because there's this goal of decarbonizing. So investment portfolios move away from brown investments into greener investments, and that immediately leads you into technology. At that point, another very, very deep box opens, and that's ethical investments and social problems and all of the questions that are associated with big tech and AI. So it's not straightforward to say, let's construct a portfolio in a way that is ESG compliant and done that let's move on. So there's a very big question of balancing interests. So that's very very interesting, I think. And then the other point is one about who does the heavy lifting in stewardship. And it looks to me like the heavy lifting needs to be done by those in whose interests the assets are ultimately invested. And I think at that point, we have identified the weak spot of stewardship, because the ultimate asset investors and beneficiaries are retail people like you and me and our pensions. And I'd like to sort of, there's of course the possibility of overcoming our inclination maybe not to act through technology. But my question here is slightly provocative. There was a study that was done by the government, and the people who live in the UK will remember this. The government a few years ago moved away from requiring pensioners to buy an annuity when they retired. And before this was done, the FCA conducted an empirical commissioned an empirical study and asked investors' perceptions. And what came back from that study was that the majority of investors care about the tax benefits associated with their investment. And they had to be prompted to come up with questions of longevity and other planning factors in relation to pensions. So the question I have is, what can be done to sort of either do we need to give up on stewardship, or what can be done to help in retail people whose money is invested to take more interest in ESG?
I'm sure you have thoughts as well. Why don't I start and then pass it on? So just because you mentioned the tax benefits, I think it is, we shouldn't underestimate, in fact, the role that financial sector taxes have in the regulatory framework. And I mean, just to illustrate the point, right, when we list fossil fuel subsidies in the UK, we don't consider the investment subsidy that the government gives people to invest in fossil fuel assets, basically. And I know that's not the same as subsidizing at the tank station, at the petrol station, but if you think that's several billion pounds a year that the US government forgoes in tax revenues associated with retail investors and pension funds and investing in fossil fuels. But just on the question of because your question is basically a transaction cost question, right? It's, okay, how can we get people to get out of bed to try and do this, right? And I think there are really two key answers. One of them is the way that technology makes it less of an effort, right? I mean, I remember when I lived in the UK, I was with Nationwide, then they send me a letter, and then you have to fill out the letter, and then you have to send the mail. And as somebody who's pretty motivated about this topic, that was a hurdle that was just too high to clear. And so if that's a hurdle that's too high for me to clear, I can't imagine that it's particularly enticing for anybody else. And so that's why I think Tumelo, that's where our work at My Fair Money is really designed to make it as easy as possible. And the nice thing is actually regulation has really plays in our favor in a lot of different ways, right? The moment I send, at least under European MiFID II regulation, the moment I send a letter to my retail advisor and telling him, look, here's my investment objective, and my investment objective is not to invest in fossil fuels, and I will consider that my fund is unsuitable if it's invested in fossil fuels, I immediately create liability. And so I transitioned the entire transaction cost to the broker or the investment manager, who's ever on the other side of that letter, because if I just fill out this letter the right way, and that can be a pre-populated letter where I put my signature under it, I immediately create liability on the other side that if they don't comply with my request, that they're in trouble, basically. And so that is something where I think transaction costs technology can be really powerful as well. I think one other issue, and I think Anna, you touched on this as well, is a little bit how foreign this feels, how kind of abstract sometimes all these issues can seem from an ethical perspective, because you're in this kind of investment world and what's going on, and we have low financial literacy and people are already intimidated to begin with. And then, to be honest, I don't think many of the sustainability metrics we currently use help in getting people out of bed neither, right? You tell somebody what their carbon footprint is, and then they say, okay, but is that a lot? If I said to you right now, my food carbon footprint is 4,000 kilos a year. Who here would be able to say if that was higher or lower than the average? Zero? I mean, I looked this up yesterday, so the only reason I can say it's because I looked it up. So, I think that's where we need to be, the same way we do this look through on shares and make people understand, look, you're not actually investing in a fund, you're an owner of Rolls-Royce. We need to make them understand that you're not just investing in funds, but you also have a sustainability footprint. One of the indicators I think is quite interesting is how many people you kill. So we know that climate change kills. We know that we have a footprint, so we kill. How many people do we kill? For the average individual in the UK, that'll be about one person in their lifetime. And that's just a different way to get people to get motivated about a topic than having me to explain to them that 4,000 kilos of carbon is a lot or not a lot. And maybe killing is a bit too dramatic for some of you in the audience. But there's definitely some way we can go towards being more able to express what the real materiality of a situation is to make it evocative and emotive in a way that is better than you have a 3 out of 5 stars in your ESG score or your CO2 per dollar invested is 3.15, right? So those would be, I think, 2 areas that I would highlight, but happy to pass it over.
Yeah, so retail investor participation is low. So distinguish between the two first. So you have retail investors, those who have opened a GIA and ISA off their own back, they've downloaded the app. On platforms right now, the number of people who vote is under 3%. For pension members, they don't vote at all. However, this actually turns out to be more of a product problem around how they are given the opportunity to vote. So if you are sent a letter, it turns out no one fills it in. However, the platforms where we've integrated, we get a 30% of the user base voting. So it really is more of a product, and I relate it back to how I started this. Technology is here to bring a better user experience to the whole process. That's kind of the point. So you can get significantly more engagement from that perspective. It's also down to for pension members, it's a bit trickier because there's an additional layer of intermediation with, say, trustees, asset owners in the chain. But they also want a voice, and the regulation is coming out around this, around expression of wish, and then having to actually influence the fund managers that they are invested in. And the technology kind of works the same. It's just at a different level. And again, it comes down to user experience. So in the past, where it has been really actually quite difficult to do all of this, by making it easier, you actually take the amount of time it takes is spent less on actually doing the thing and more time actually thinking about it, about the stewardship, and putting thought into the accountability piece.
I agree with all of that. I think we have to I think when we're looking at technological improvements, we're kind of, I don't know if this is true or not, but I guess you're dealing with a group of people who are already converted, right? They're already coming to use your platform, maybe. And then if the tech makes it easier, more people are going to do it, right? But I guess I would tend to take a step back and say, actually, there's like a broader perception shift that needs to happen to really get people interested in ESG in the first place. Like when people talk about the climate crisis or, the health crisis, we don't really talk about the role of investors as a part of that. We talk about the role of companies and we talk about the role of policymakers. And we do a lot of work to kind of bring people on that journey to understanding the role of the investment community at ShareAction. And I think you'd need to do a little bit of kind of education to kind of unlock in people's minds that the power that the investment community has over these crises. Because I think once people realize that, they're very, very motivated to get involved and take an interest in ESG. And then when they find a platform like Tumelo, they're like, great, this is so easy. But I think you kind of have to do the tech alongside the broader education shift to kind of really mobilize the mass of people that you need to drive that shift. I don't know if you disagree, but
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I've got now time for questions, and I think there's a question from Ewan and from Marco and over here. So 3 questions.
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Hi. Ewan McGahey, King's College London Law School. I think I've really got a question for Will, but maybe others would like to jump into it. Everything's fascinating. So I teach a group of students, and we have a course called Enterprise Law. And at the end of the year, the law school gives us 15 quid to go to the pub. And I asked everyone, would you like to put the 15 quid together at the start of the year, pool it all, and invest in some companies, and then we can see, what it does, and we got to choose a diversified portfolio, right? Modern portfolio theory, and you should think about ethical investing, and so we did all this, and then I was like, right, okay, so we picked our stocks. Now, how on earth do I do this. So the first thing was look around for apps, and what you find in all this fintech stuff is most of them are shams. Like you've got contracts for difference trading through eToro and what's the other one? Plus 500. It's nonsense. We ended up with free trade where you can get like fractional shares. But then I couldn't find one where you could actually vote. So free trade doesn't allow. I couldn't find one in the UK. Somebody recommended Revolut later on, and on the continent there's Trade Republic. And so the point is you've got all these wonderful apps that allow people to invest, but actually in Britain so far getting voting rights through is not something that's happened. So my question is Tumelo developing, or could it be possible to work with apps or make your own app that could allow that in Britain? And the other thing is just, our pension fund in the university sector is terrible. They don't listen to us on anything. And could they be one of your future clients?
Yeah, so we of course have colleagues who have written and complained about the fact that the big three, including Vanguard, BlackRock, they don't have enough resources to take really informed voting decisions. I mean, how do you expect retail investors to really take informed decisions? Or if you go to the political analogy, I mean, we vote for political parties, but we don't have such a good experience with referendum voting, except that referenda are much less common than, shareholder resolutions.
Thanks. Does this work? Oh. Hi, my name is Deborah Gilshan. I'm an independent advisor on investment stewardship, and I've worked across the investment chain for 2 asset owners and an asset manager. This has been such a fascinating discussion, and I think disruptive technologies can help, I guess, the empowerment and the informing around stewardship and shareholder rights. However, we have a more fundamental problem and challenge, and that's about trust. If we want retail shareholders and the general public to invest and to engage, we have a huge trust deficit in financial services. The Edelman Trust Barometer tells us that since 2012, financial services has been the least trusted sector, and only this year, the only other sector that was least trusted behind financial services was social media companies. And I think the role of stewardship, invisible stewardship, like annual general meeting statements and shareholder proposals, is all part of how we demonstrate the role of finance and stewarding other people's capital. And I've never quite understood the reticence amongst shareholders to use the platform of the annual general meeting. The 3 investors I've worked for always use that as a strategy. It's such an important tool. And I think one really interesting piece that could come out of today is an analysis and a debate about the annual general meeting and exercising your right as a member to turn up and ask questions. Unfortunately, the AGM is in the public domain and being debated currently for all the wrong reasons around deeply sexist comments made to the women on the board at Aviva. But I think that the role of the AGM is so vital, but we have to have a conversation about why it's not used to its full potential.
Great, thank you. So who would like to?
Hi, sorry. I've just received one question from the online.
Okay, I'll take that. Let's answer the 3 and then
the next one. We've had someone say end investors could play a positive role in engaging in systemic risks like environmental issues, but with regard to firm-specific engagement, they may make uninformative decisions which may harm stewardship decisions. How can you overcome this problem? Thanks.
I think that connects well with Marco's question about how getting informed input from investors.
Hi, yeah. So I'll start with the first question, which is voting on retail platforms. Oh, there's a hand up. Sorry. Should I pause?
No, you go.
Oh, sorry. Got you. Okay. Hand signaling. Yeah, so we started with pension platforms. We're coming for the retail ones as well at some point. So at some point this year. So that is the goal. If you want to be able to cast an expression of wish through funds, use the Cushion app. They've done a full integration. And they do a general investment account. So yeah, we're working on it. It's just there's a huge amount of complexity in the back end, if that makes sense. So sorry, front end and back end is more of a technology term. So it's very hard to figure out where to put the votes, if that makes sense, and plug them into a system. The piping for moving votes around is horribly complex. So that's kind of the blocker in a lot of the places. Did anyone else have a comment on the first question? Second?
I could go ahead, but then
sure. Expect people to make informed decisions. We get this all the time, actually. So I guess we see our role as more being the place that democratizes the access to being able to vote. So we really don't put forwards an opinion. We put forwards the proxy document. We put forwards the annual report. People can read them if they want before casting a vote, but we are here to provide them access, not to provide advice. That is very much a line that we take. As a fundamental principle, we believe that actually giving people access is incredibly important. So I think we've seen it really in the financial markets already with the likes of, say, Robinhood, where anyone can invest for as little as £1. It's fractional investing. I would make the argument that that is a great thing from an access perspective to the financial markets. I would make the same case for voting, which is, I think it's really important to democratize the access in the first instance. And then maybe we can layer on proxy advice in the future, which is already exists. But yeah, we are really more about the democratization in the first instance.
Yeah, I feel like there is actually a connection between the second, fourth, and third question, because part of the reason why we have trust issues is because we don't have access, right? And so this is obviously ties together. Just to echo what William said, right? I mean, the first principle is that this is your right. And so we may not be happy about people using their right all the time. And some people feel that way about voting and political processes as well. But this is your right. You are the owner, and this is your share. And this is the power that the political framework that we live in gives you with your share. And the fact that we have this political system where we do that as well is, I think, it's just the same principle that applies here. And if we sat here and said maybe we shouldn't have people vote anymore because we have, I don't know, they're not informed and they don't know enough about how to handle this process, I think is a pretty hot take. But actually what happens in voting, of course, is that we give somebody else a mandate to make the detailed decisions for us, right? And there's nothing that prevents the same process from happening here. You know, we have a counterparty of trust. That's typically the political party that you vote for. You don't vote for all the legislation. You say, all right, I believe Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer or whoever, right, Caroline Lucas or the other, Ed Davey. Wow, I'm getting there. Or whoever they are, right? That I let them decide, right? But at least there's this point, and that's really important, I think, for politicians. There's this point where they have been nominated to fulfill that trust. And actually, this doesn't happen in the broker conversation when you in the investment advice process itself. You have a suitability questionnaire. You get onboarded onto a fund based on your risk return profile, but you never in this process get asked how you would want to generally express the shareholder power that you have. Now you can take a Tumelo approach and say, right, well, you can vote on every resolution and yes, no, or what have you. But even before that, how is it that when you're onboarded onto this fund, the entire power that comes with the fund there's never any onboarding on how you want that people to express the power. It's kind of like saying, and this would be a political, if we take again the equivalent from a political party, you actually all of a sudden you're voting, but you just don't know which party you're voting for. And that's what's happening in the asset management industry at the moment. And we're in this stage where 3% make decisions. In reality, we'll probably, if we had like a best case future, we'll still probably have at least half of the individuals delegate that power in some form, but delegate it with purpose so that we can decide who we want our agents to be that can make those informed decisions and that can avoid the unintended consequences that came from the fourth questionnaire as well.
Yeah, just quickly, I think what you said, Jakob, about the link between access and trust is so true. Like part of what we do at ShareAction is we try and educate individual citizens about the role of their money. And one of the tricky things for us to do is we're trying to convince people that investors can be, people who are like quite skeptical about the role of finance, that investors can be a force for good, right? And that like they can be really, really effective stewards. But it's really hard to have that conversation when you're telling someone that about their pension fund and they're like, well, you won't even tell me what my like 11th investment is. You give me my top 10 investments, but that's it. Like it's so closely linked. And then just on the point about worrying about like individual people making the wrong decisions when it comes to stewardship, not being informed, like I guess I'm a little bit I think there's maybe like an underlying assumption there that like investors are always making the right decisions, and that like by handing over power to citizens we're going to stop making the right decisions. And I think maybe that assumption needs to be challenged, because like on the whole, like the investment community as a collective is still leading the world to like a climate crisis, and maybe listening to the values of ordinary citizens might be more valuable.
Thank you very much. So next round of questions. Yes, please. You go, yeah.
Is that going to work?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, great. Excellent.
Working well.
Okay. Yes, I'm Helen Mussell from Cardiff University and the University of Cambridge. I'm an academic. I work on the fiduciary duty, actually, and what we seem to be talking about here is beneficiary apathy at the end of the day, and whether or not this is cumulative and is learnt over a long period of time. So it seems appropriate in the School of Law to ask whether or not we actually think that the legal concept of the fiduciary is actually doing the work that it needs to do. Is this a problem with the dynamic that we have between the trustee and the beneficiary? Is it time to rethink it less as a duty and more as a relationship? Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. I have a question that I think is perhaps mainly for Michael. It's a technical question that I don't know the answer to, Michael. Just when you say you initiate 5 resolutions a year, I'm just wondering what they look like. Because of course we're talking as if, you know, shareholders can exercise these powers, but they're tightly constrained in many jurisdictions. They can't, you know, cross into managerial matters. Some jurisdictions, such as the US, permit non-binding resolutions. Other jurisdictions, like Australia, do not. So I'm just wondering what yours look like. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a question from online.
Yeah. So someone asked a question for William or Jacob. Can the tech revolution in this area only help individuals regain a sense of ownership, or also a sense of responsibility for their preferences, taking into account that they have been traditionally depicted as apathetic or irresponsible market actors, and that regulation will be increasingly focused on funds' obligation to integrate the members' sustainability preferences? Bit of a long one.
Great, thank you. And Andrew.
Yes, thank you. Andrew Stevenson, I'm Head of Engagement at Morris Sodali. In my previous life, I used to be a retail broker, so I used to see this all the time. One of the biggest problems with voting for retail investors is the cost. So a lot of the brokers will charge quite a significant amount of money to be able to vote. And also the custodial chain is very complicated because it's all held in pooled funds and it's not so clear cut most of the time. A lot of information isn't passed down from the custodians, so investors don't get access to the annual report and that sort of stuff. So a lot of retail investors tend to be apathetic because of that very reason. It's just a real problem to get that information to be able to vote. And if you hold 100 shares in Rolls-Royce, a lot of retail say, what difference am I going to make? It's 100 shares. You know, I'm not going to format any sort of change at all. So that's why you do get a lot of apathy. I just want to say that. So saying that with, I think it's William, you know, how are you going to make that an easier process? Because the costs are borne by somebody. You know, the custodians will charge for being able to vote. So how do retail investors be able to vote without, you know, free of charge? I'm quite curious about that.
Great, wonderful. Final question from Sarah.
Thank you. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't make up law on the hoof, because some of the things that are being discussed here are just not legal. We've got to be really, really careful that we don't mislead people. The ultimate beneficial owner is not the legal owner of shares. And the concepts between the US and the UK are vastly different. So the financial services regulation, which is taken care of by the FCA, is not company law. And so we've just got to be super duper careful about this, because we're going to end up with people who think, oh, it's whoopee, I am a shareholder, I can vote. There's a very big difference between an expression of wish that a trustee board will make after due consultation, because back to fiduciary responsibility that the trustees have. Yeah, and just to echo what Andrew says, there are lots of vested interests in the voting chain. And having been casting electronic votes since 1996, I've met them head on. They're big, they're ugly, and we're still waiting for the Law Commission to sort out some basic things. So where are the vested interests? Well, they're there, absolutely, without a doubt. But let's be super duper careful that we don't try and put across an idea that doesn't legally exist. We're going to let people down. And I think to Deborah's point about loss of trust, we will lose people's trust if we say, this is a thing. No, we're not there yet. Law Commission's got a lot of work to do. We're not in the US. Shareholder resolutions exist because shareholders have so few rights in America as compared with Commonwealth countries. So it's a really super interesting and important debate, but we need to be really, really clear.
Thank you. Wonderful. So final round from the panel.
Yeah, I definitely want to address that final point. Absolutely, from a beneficiary perspective, they do not have the legal right to vote, and that is not what we are doing for them. We are collecting expressions of wish, preferences that we take back to the trustee, who then takes it back to the fund manager, and we also translate it to the fund manager there as well. So we are definitely not giving them a legal vote in that respect, especially if they're a pension member. That would definitely not be happening. That is for sure.
Yeah, I can take the question that was directed to me. So on the specifics of the resolutions that we file, they're all predominantly UK based. We filed our first resolution in the EU this year at Credit Suisse. But the three we filed in the UK, just as examples, were at HSBC, sort of asking them to phase out financing of fossil fuels on a timeline consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. At Sainsbury's, asking them to pay the living wage to all their staff. And at Unilever, asking them to set targets and improve their standards on the sale of healthy foods, all linked to kind of aspects of company strategy.
See, they would not be legitimate resolutions in Australia.
Yeah, well, the legislation is so different across. I mean, the filing requirements are so different. And then just to the fiduciary duty question as well, we've always thought lots about fiduciary duty and the role of this at Share Action. And I think our take on it is very much that, like, across the board, I guess the understanding of like the best interest part of fiduciary duty is what needs to change. Like, best interest is still understood on the whole, despite legal clarifications, as being about profit and about return. And I think when you consider the climate crisis, that feels a little bit absurd in some ways. So there needs to be some evaluation of that, I think.
Well, it's just, I thought the exchange between William and Sarah was really interesting for a non-lawyer. So just to be super clear, so TUMO is not a voting platform, it is a survey monkey, is that correct?
So we're moving into voting in Q4. Right now, we take the preferences back to the fund manager, who take it into account when doing the legal vote. We have some signing up for split voting, but it is like preferences at this point.
So it's a survey monkey. Okay, great. Thanks.
Just perhaps briefly, and then hand it over to you. Fiduciary duty, obviously a big deal in the Anglo-Saxon world, so it's a little bit less my world, despite having rattled off the political leaders of the UK, which is something I need to check why I should know that. It's too much news junkie. Anyway, but I think we have this concept with the suitability concept, right, in MiFID II, which means that the suitability is defined based on your objective, and your fiduciary duty in that equivalent thinking is to comply with the investment objective of the person, which is a fancy way of saying is why you're bringing the money there. What is your goal to bring the money there, right? And that's not the same as preferences or, oh, it would be fun to invest in emerging markets or renewables. You have a goal with your money. What is the goal that you're trying to achieve? And is the goal to just maximize returns? Is the goal to maximize returns under constraint? We, for example, did a lot of focus groups with religious investors who say, I don't want to invest in alcohol, for example, or other sin stocks. It's not because I want to rid the world of alcohol necessarily, it's just I don't want to touch it. That's my religious perspective, and that's it. So that's where I draw the line. And so I do think that actually there is some agency here in defining what you as the person that is delegating that responsibility, if you will, what is the process and what are the terms under which you delegate? And that's what I said before, right? What are you telling your broker, or what are you telling your investment manager what you want them to do with their money? And obviously, realistically, given the underinformed public that we have when it comes to finance, you're not telling them very much, but that's where regulation is really important. That's what's happening in Europe now, that fund managers, brokers have to ask questions around these sustainability objectives. And there's actually quite a significant discussion right now whether those, independent of the fiduciary duty objective, whether those technically have to be complied with or not. And so there's different pros and cons, which we won't have time to get into today. But I do want to get, I think the question, if I understood it well, about the responsibility. And I mean, one of the key things that we're taking out of this conversation is that there are a lot of similarities between voting and political processes and voting here, right? Starting with the fact that you're voting in both cases, right? But if you think about, if you as an individual think about your footprint on this world, most people probably take voting and political processes pretty serious, right? We probably have a pretty high percentage here in the audience that votes regularly, assuming that they're citizens of countries where this is their right. But we don't, I would say, probably think about voting and investment processes, or even getting involved in this voting process independently, right, with the same diligence. But if you think about footprinting your impact, you do this every year, there's a case that there's actually a close relationship between the potential impact between the two. And going back to the misinformation problem, in the last European Parliament elections, we had, I think, 80 or 90% of voters vote for parties that signed up to the Paris Agreement. So what's the percent of shareholder resolution support to get companies to sign up to support and be aligned with the Paris Agreement, right? We're talking here in the 20 or 30 percentile. So there's a democracy gap here. And if we fill that democracy gap, I think we'll have a lot of benefits. On the one hand, I think we'll actually have more sustainable companies because retail investors and ultimate beneficiaries care about sustainability more than the professionals that manage their money. It's just, that's what we know from surveys and a lot of empirical data. We'll have more responsibility, going back to the question from the audience, more agency, you feel more involved. You feel differently after you've had that glass of champagne, not just because you've had a glass of champagne. And that also can help build trust, because you do feel like, hey, this is a process where I can get involved, where I can have a say, and where there's transparency about why the company's doing what it's doing, and there's transparency about the road that we're on. And I think William highlighted really well, actually, a big part of this problem is not the back end is such a big part of the problem, but what we see in our MyFairMoney platform as well is the user experience actually is the make or break part of this, because the back end is hard and you can't figure everything out, but give yourself some time and you can figure a lot of the stuff out in the back end. But we need to get to the point where we have that awareness that this is just like voting in a political process in the sense of your footprint, and that you need to take it just as serious as a result. And that awareness can be raised through information campaigns like Share Action, but it also needs to be visible at the moment when you interface with that world. And that is going to be in the future primarily a digital way that we interface.
Thank you. Let me just quickly react to the fiduciary question. I do think that the involvement of pension trustees provides a limit to what stewardship can do, because their mandate has to be looking after the financial well-being of the investors. And I don't think there's ways of doing that is sympathetic to E and S goals, but I do think it's ultimately a limit to what stewardship can achieve. So having stepped out of my role here as chair, let me just say thank you very, very much to the panelists. I think we achieved something a panel has to do. We drew out the difficult questions and threw up some answers. Thank you very much.